Good evening. So happy you could all join us tonight. Hello and welcome to this evening's Incite event with the Vancouver Writers Festival in partnership with Vancouver Public Library. I am Amber Ritchie with the Vancouver Public Library, the Programming and Learning Department, and I would like to begin this evening by acknowledging that my home and the VPL are on the unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Incite, captivating explorations of books and ideas, is a long-standing program that we're delighted to bring to you this evening. I'm also hoping that you'll join us next Wednesday at 10 o'clock as we celebrate Lunar New Year with a program called Dear Dumpling. Vancouver locals from Happy Woman Kitchen and Dixon and Pearl's Dickie's Dumplings will share stories about dumplings, the history of dumplings, recipes, and a live online dumpling making session. That's next Wednesday, February 10 at 7. And you can find more information about it online at the library vpl.ca or through our electronic newsletter. I now ask that you send out warm thoughts of welcome to Leslie Hertig, Artistic Director of the Vancouver Writers Festival.
Thank you so much, Amber, and welcome everybody. Hello. Welcome to Incite. You are in for a treat this evening. We have not one, but 3 best-selling writers here to talk about their books, each one of them exquisitely propelling. And I'm talking about the kind of books that drive readers to stay up into the wee hours of the night so that they can get these books finished. That's why we're here tonight. We're going to talk a bit more about these books. They're the kind of books that leave you with lingering ideas and questions as well. We would like to thank our Incite partner, the Vancouver Public Library, for their support, and also our government sponsors, the Government of Canada, the Government of BC, the BC Arts Council, the City of Vancouver, and CMHC Granville Island, our home down here on Granville Island. This is our second Incite event of the season, and here's just a little reminder that we'll be hosting events every other Wednesday between now and June, as well as some special events and our digital book club. Mark your calendars now also, because our flagship festival will return in the 3rd week of October, hopefully down here on Granville Island. After tonight's event, you will receive an email survey in your inbox. Please take the time to fill this survey out. It gives us an idea of how we're doing and how we can improve your experiences as audience members. One lucky survey participant will be winning a copy of a forthcoming Incite book. So please do fill that out. The format for tonight is pretty straightforward. I'm going to be speaking with our 3 guests and then inviting you to submit your questions for them using the comment function. We'll get to as many of those as possible before wrapping up in just a little over an hour from now. And now please let me introduce our 3 special guests this evening. Hailed by The Guardian as a writer of scrupulous precision, American author Rumaan Alam's writing has appeared in publications such as The New Yorker, Book Forum, and The New Republic, where he is also a contributing editor. Stupendously good and deserves a place among the classics of dystopic fiction are just a couple among the multitude of praise from the likes of the Washington Post, NPR, and the Los Angeles Review of Books for his latest novel, Leave the World Behind. Here it is here. Leave the World Behind is Rumaan's 3rd novel and was a finalist for the 2020 National Book Awards. It's currently being adapted as a Netflix film with a star-studded cast, I hear, including Julia Roberts and Denzel Washington. Joining us from New York is Rumaan Alam. Hi, Rumaan.
Hi, thank you.
I'm going to continue now. Next up is Canadian author Ashley Audrain. Ashley Audrain's best-selling novel, The Push, not only topped industry lists prior to publication as one of the most anticipated books of 2021, but also broke records with 34 translation rights deals and an upcoming screen adaptation, delivered to abundant industry praise, with Newsweek calling The Push a taut and tense hurricane of a debut, and the New York Times noting Ashley's gift for capturing the seemingly small moments that speak volumes. Perhaps the Toronto Star says it best: The Push is one hell of a way to start the year of reading. Joining us from Toronto is Ashley Audrain. Hi, Ashley.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for having me.
And finally, Vancouver's own Silvia Moreno-Garcia describes herself as Mexican by birth, but Canadian by inclination. Slate, in its review of her newest book, Mexican Gothic, commends Silvia's skill with the Baroque and hallucinatory as peerless. Mexican Gothic, lauded by NPR as a pitch-perfect Gothic novel, succeeds Silvia's critically acclaimed and best-selling speculative novels. Vox described this book as a deliciously true to Gothic form, and readers will concur, as Silvia masterfully conjures an unease that lingers long after the final page. I can attest to that. Mexican Gothic is also getting a television series adaptation over at Hulu. You three are all doing very, very well, I'd say. Welcome to the Vancouver Writers Fest Incite series. We're thrilled to have you here.
Hi.
Hi. So there is a slow burn to each of your books, and we'll get to craft a little later on, but I just have to say that reading such intensely crafted thrillers in the middle of a pandemic almost to me was a bit cathartic, takes you away. We all need these books that take you away. How are you all feeling about releasing or at least promoting these books in this pandemic time? It's not what you planned when you were publishing, when you were first launching your titles. How has this been for you? Rumaan, let's start with you.
I think that the book will always have its devotees, and in a cultural moment where we can't go out to the movie theater, where we can't go to hear the Philharmonic, what we can do is read books. And I think I hope that it's brought a lot of comfort to readers, and I know it has for me. I heard from people that they had trouble reading, or they had trouble having a book hold their attention. That has not been my experience. And I think that libraries and our independent bookstores have done such a good job of responding to the insane conditions of the moment by moving events online, like the one that we're doing tonight, or arranging curbside pickup at your local indie. So I think that people who love books have really, in a strange way, this is a moment for people who love books. It's a reminder of what it is we love about them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed. Silvia, how about you? You often write in the speculative area. How has this time, this strange time that we're in now, affected you as a writer and the launch of this book?
Well, it was odd because we didn't know if I didn't know if I would have a career around this time, last year, because of everything that was happening. I thought this might be my last book. But the good thing about having failed constantly as a writer before is that it wasn't as scary as it sounded, because before my books had been remaindered. A previous publisher of mine had basically closed down. My editor left. I was shuffled between 4 different editors, I think, in a period of, I don't know, a few months. So having gone through that, having, gotten advances as large and exciting as $500, it was just like, well, if I fail, I fail. And I published a few books. And so I didn't feel, some people had like a lot of pressure, and I was just like, well, maybe it'll be another book that goes under the radar, which is what everyone said about me before. It's like, oh, your books are always under the radar. And I thought, well, it might be remaindered again, but at least it was fun while it lasted. Yeah, so that didn't happen, which was really good, because I think otherwise my agent had been kind of shopping my next book around quite a bit, and I think we were running out of publishers. So that was the only concern. It was like, would there be any publishers left at the end that would ever consider me? So hope this one opened big, and so then suddenly we had no problem selling my next unsellable book, which all the editors had said was not viable. Suddenly everybody was like suddenly I was commercially viable. I remember an editor who said about me that I would never break out. So, I was like, all right.
Well, this is it. And I would like to come back and revisit this whole issue of all three of your books being optioned in different ways. We'll come back to that. But Ashley, for you as a debut novelist, how has this experience under these conditions been for you, and how are you feeling about it all?
Yeah, it's funny because I feel like very naively when this pandemic first started, I thought, oh, well, my book's out in January, so everything will be okay by then. I think we kind of all thought that, and it's certainly not. But yeah, but I think like Rumaan was saying, I think it's just been so heartening to see how reading has really endured through this, and how many people, just sort of anecdotally, I know who, didn't often pick up a book and are picking up books now, which is just, it's really incredible to see. I think books are really having a moment, as you said. And so I think I worried with the push. It's a dark book. And I did wonder, is this going to be the time for, uplit kind of fiction? And are people going to want to be reading, very optimistic things? And I did worry about that aspect of it, but actually, and I have found this in my own reading taste as well, I am gravitating towards sort of those darker stories. I think we all sort of are, in a way. I think as a way of kind of working through, the environment we are in right now and the feelings many of us are having. So I'm grateful that the book's being received in the way it is right now. Yeah.
Quite right. And the really interesting thing I think about each of your books is it represents something more than just a thriller or a suspenseful good read. Each of you in your own way are touching on some pretty important underlying themes here, whether it be white supremacy in Silvia's book, generational trauma in your book, Ashley, and also issues around race relations in your book, Rumaan. All of these things are very current in today's cycle, underlying everything else that's happening with the pandemic. So for me, reading them, also listening to them on Libro FM, I really had a sense of almost understanding more about what's going on in our current world right now. So I do thank you all for that. Rumaan, I'd like to turn over to you for a moment just to say about Leave the World Behind. This is a book that was written pre-pandemic, but so perfectly encapsulates the building dread and suspenseful nature of our current world. I enjoyed it so very much. As Rolling Stone said, it kind of captures that universal horror of the apocalypse, which at times, some of us have had a feeling that this is a little bit of what's happening for us right now, not really knowing where we're going, where are we going. The book so well encapsulates that feeling. Do you think you could read a little bit for us tonight?
Sure. My book is about a family who are on vacation on Long Island, and the second night of their stay, they're renting a house through Airbnb. The second night of their stay, a couple arrives at the door and says that it's their house, and there's been an emergency in New York City and they've fled to the house to seek shelter. And the next morning, Clay, the father of the family renting the house, gets in his car to drive to town and figure out what's happening in the world. So I'm just going to read a short scene from where Clay is driving into town. The brain was a marvel. You could drive without wholly thinking about driving. Sure, familiar routes, the everyday commute. Start the car, find the highway, maneuver through lanes, take the usual exit, glide to stops at red lights, move forward at green ones, while not exactly hearing the top stories being reiterated on NPR, or thinking about some slight at the office, or remembering a production of The Pirates of Penzance you saw the summer between 6th and 7th grades. Driving was rote. It was something you just did. He wasn't actually thinking about the production of The Pirates of Penzance he'd seen the summer between 6th and 7th grades, though he remembered that as the golden temporary season in which he'd been his mother's favorite child. But he must have been thinking about something, because Clay turned at some point and drove for some distance. He found estimating distance and measures of volume impossible, and realized that though he was definitely on a road, a more serious 2-lane road, the sort of road the GPS would know and name, he could not be certain, not really, that it was the road he'd wanted. There were directions written down in Amanda's notebook, of course, but Amanda's notebook was back at the house in Amanda's Vuitton bag. Anyway, the ability to take written directions to one destination and simply invert them to move in reverse was an obsolete art. It was like winding the car windows down with a crank. Human progress. Clay was lost. Everything was green. There was nothing to hold on to. There were some trees, there was a field, a glimpse of roof and the promise of a building, but he couldn't say whether it was a barn or a house. The road curved and then he emerged somewhere else where there was another field and some more trees and another slice of roof or barn or house. And Clay thought of those old cartoons that recycled their backgrounds to create the illusion of movement. It was impossible to say what was more sensible, to stop the car and backtrack, or to forge ahead as though he knew where he were going. He didn't even know how long he'd been driving or whether he'd know the turn back onto the road that led to the gravel driveway up to the house where his family waited. He didn't know whether that road was marked by a sign or what the sign would say. Maybe he ought to have paid closer attention. The sound of the wind and the sensation of it on his face was distracting. Clay slowed the car a little and sent the windows back up, then jabbed at the center panel until the air conditioning came to life. He continued straight, but that wasn't exactly correct since the road undulated and twisted, and maybe he'd gone in a complete circuit. And that was why the trees and occasional buildings looked so familiar, because they were. There were no other cars, and he didn't know if that seemed odd or not. Anyway, it was not the kind of road for stop signs. The local planners trusted the local people. He pulled onto the dusty shoulder and turned the car around and drove in the direction from which he'd come. Now nothing looked familiar, though he'd just driven through it. It was all inverted, and he noticed things on the left side of the road that he'd missed when they'd been on his right. There was a road on his right, and he turned to look up it as he passed, but it was not the road that led to the house, because that road had a little painted shack where you could get a dozen eggs for $5. He sped up and drove on. There was another turnoff, but again, no painted shack. Then he wondered whether he'd turned twice to get to the road where he now found himself and was looking for a landmark that did not exist. Then he remembered that, of course, his phone had not been working. That was the real purpose of this errand. He had driven out to show everyone that he was a man in control, and now he was lost and felt ridiculous.
There's that building dread, that building dread that simmers through the entire book. I loved that about the book. And I loved how, well, eerily familiar it felt, you know, in a way. The way you reference throughout, not only from the children's point of view, the teenagers' point of view, but the others as well, the reliance that we all now have on our phones and that almost addiction. And at one point, I believe one of your characters wonders if perhaps the feeling he's having is the feeling of, you know, that addiction.
Withdrawal, yes, withdrawal. I think we all know
exactly.
what that,
Yeah.
we all know what that feels like, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, and yes, it really allows the reader to think about what would that be like to suddenly not have technology and to not know what's going on. It's really, really wonderful. Ashley, I'd love to ask you to also read. I think I neglected to hold up, whoops, there it is, hold up the push earlier, but here it is here. Again, with that building dread, you start out with a scene, you kind of go in full circle. Your book starts out with a scene that gives the reader a bit of an idea of what's happening with your main character, Blythe, but we don't quite understand why. And I'd love to, with all of you, talk about, you know, how you built these worlds and how you built the suspense that ends up carrying us through the whole novel. But would you mind reading us a little bit of The Push?
Yes, I'd love to. And I'll read a little bit from that opening scene that you mentioned. And so to sort of, doesn't require too much setup because it is the opening scene, but it's a story of a woman named Blythe, and she comes from a history of women who have really struggled with motherhood. And she's determined that she's going to break that cycle in her own life and that she's going to be a very warm, you know, present, engaged mother. to her own children. And that does not go as she has planned. And sort of this is really a story of the unraveling of that family. And so I'll read just a short bit from this opening chapter. Your house glows at night like everything inside is on fire. The drapes she chose for the windows look like linen, expensive linen. The weave is loose enough that I can usually read your mood. I can watch the girl flip her ponytail while she finishes homework. I can watch the little boy toss tennis balls at the 12-foot ceiling while your wife lunges around the living room in leggings, reversing the day's mess. Toys back in the basket, pillows back on the couch. Tonight, though, you've left the drapes open, maybe to see the snow falling, maybe so your daughter could look for reindeer. She's long stopped believing, but she will pretend for you, anything for you. You've all dressed up. The children are in matching plaids sitting on the leather ottoman as your wife takes their picture with her phone. The girl is holding the boy's hand. You're fiddling with the record player at the back of the room, and your wife is speaking to you, but you hold up a finger. You've almost got it. The girl jumps up, and your wife, she sweeps up the boy and they spin. You lift a drink, scotch, and sip it once, twice, and slink from the record like it's a sleeping baby. That's how you always start to dance. You take him. He throws his head back and you tip him upside down. Your daughter reaches up for daddy's kiss and your wife holds your drink for you. She sways over to the tree and adjusts a string of lights that isn't sitting quite right. And then you all stop and lean toward one another and shout something in unison, some word perfectly timed. And then you all move again. This is a song you know well. Your wife slips out of the room and her son's face follows robotically. I remember that feeling of being the needed one. Matches. She comes back to light the candles on a decorated mantle, and I wonder if the snaking fir boughs are real, if they smell like the tree farm. I let myself imagine, for a moment, watching those boughs go up in flames while you all sleep tonight. I imagine the warm, butter yellow glow of your house turning to a hot, crackling red. The boy has picked up an iron poker, and the girl gently takes it away before you or your wife notices. The good sister, the helper, the protector. I don't normally watch for this long, but you're all so beautiful tonight, and I can't bring myself to leave.
Thank you. What I really loved about that opening scene is that as a reader, we're not really sure if the protagonist, if the voice that we're hearing is to be believed. Is she the one maybe who has the issue? Is it her fault? Is there blame there? And again, kind of carrying through your story, the reader is never 100% sure, which I think speaks to a bigger current that runs through, which is that whole issue of not being believed, not necessarily being heard, and a bit of a frustration over that. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so that, it's told in this sort of hybrid second person perspective. The book is written to you, and you is her husband. And so just at the end of this first chapter, we learn that she has come here to give this story to him. And she, declares this to be sort of her side of the story of their life together. And so, yeah, so we get such a tight perspective, I think, in this novel, and we really feel like we are in the middle of this marriage. And it is very, it's certainly a story about motherhood and expectations, and what happens when those are not met, in the least in Blythe's case. But it really is also, I think, a story about marriage and about parenthood in a marriage and how that changes each person and kind of changes that relationship. But yeah, I think many people have asked me sort of, is Blythe an unreliable narrator or not? And I think there's some divided opinions on that, because my hope is that the reader really does believe that what she is telling us is certainly her truth. We know that there are different versions of truth and different people's perspectives, but it certainly is her, what she believes to be true. So yeah.
Yeah, and you certainly make that clear as you conclude the story. which again is just wonderful. Silvia, on to you. And here is the, oops, there we go. Here is Mexican Gothic. Little bit different from these other two books in that it has a historical setting, but equally slow burning. What I just loved about this story is the Gothic nature of it and the supernatural elements that are built into it. And Sylvia, before I ask you to read a little bit from Mexican Gothic, I wonder if you could tell our viewers tonight a little bit about the difference between Gothic horror and female Gothic, which I heard you speak about a little bit in another interview. It just really, it helped me to understand this story even more. So could you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, Gothic is a big category, and so scholars have divided it as female Gothic and male Gothic. There's sometimes a question about whether these terms are accurate or not, but they have been widely used. And what male Gothic means essentially is horror Gothic. So we've got the monk and Dracula, those kinds of stories there. There's a lot more violence, explicit elements, downer elements, one could say. Whereas the female Gothic is romantic Gothic. And those are Scooby-Doo kind of stories where the female character is there to solve a certain mystery and at the end find romantic fulfillment. So Jane Eyre is one of those classic romantic Gothic plots. It's not a ghost in the attic, it's an ex-wife, mad wife in the attic. And at the end, she gets together with Mr. Rochester. Whether you like him or not, the story presents it as a story of romantic fulfillment in some way or another. So there are these two kind of flavors of Gothic. And what happens sometimes is that if people have only encountered one flavor, so if all they've read is Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights and more of the 1960s Gothic revival books, which are the ones we recognize with women on the cover running away from a castle, Nine Coaches Waiting, those kinds of books, Dragonwyck. If you've only read those, then sometimes the other side, the horror Gothic, the male Gothic, comes as a shock. So, and vice versa, people who have been, had a steady diet of your Draculas and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and your Frankensteins, upon encountering the female Gothic with its, romantic elements, may be like, yuck, right? Wuthering Heights, Kathy and the Moors, that kind of stuff. So, but they are both part and parcel of this genre, and they both share elements. It's just that it is a proto category in a way. It's kind of like the distant ancestor of modern takes, such as modern horror, or even modern characters such as 50 Shades of Grey. The Byronic hero that we have there is really kind of like a bastardized version of some of these Gothic heroes of years before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you so beautifully melded those two, I think. You've got definitely that simmering horror that's happening, but also a bit of the romantic and certainly fashionable and beautifully set part of what I would call, I guess, more the romantic Gothic. Could you read a little bit for us and set it up for us?
Sure. So my book takes place in 1950 and it begins in Mexico City, but we quickly move out of there. Our heroine, Noemi Taboada, is a wealthy young socialite living the high life when one day her family gets a troubling note from a cousin of theirs who has recently married into this British family that is living in the mountains of Hidalgo in the countryside. And the letter says that there's something fishy going on in the house. And so Noemi heads over to this estate to see what is going on. Is her cousin going insane, or is there some secret trouble afoot? So this scene is from chapter 2, and it's when she is arriving in this small town to see what's up. Noemi was prepared for the chill of the mountain. The unexpected element was therefore the thin fog that greeted her that afternoon. She looked at it curiously as she adjusted her teal calotte hat with the long yellow feather and peered onto the street looking at her ride, for there could hardly be any mistaking it. It was the single automobile parked in front of the station, a preposterously large vehicle that made her think of swanky silent film stars of 2 or 3 decades earlier. The kind of automobile her father might have driven in his youth to flaunt his wealth. But the vehicle in front of her was dated, dirty, and it needed a paint job. Therefore, it was not truly the kind of automobile a movie star would drive these days, but seemed to be a relic that had been haphazardly dusted off and dragged onto the street. She thought the driver might match the car and expected to find an elderly man behind the wheel, but a young fellow of about her age in a corduroy jacket stepped out. He was fair-haired and pale. She didn't realize anyone could be that pale. Goodness, did he ever wander into the sun? His eyes uncertain, his mouth straining to form a smile or a greeting. Noemi paid the boys who had helped bring her luggage out, then marched forward and extended her hand. "I am Noemi Tabuada. Has Mr. Joel sent you?" she asked. "Yes, Uncle Howard said to pick you up," he replied, shaking her hand weakly. "I'm Francis. I hope the ride was pleasant. Those are all your things, Miss Tabuada? Can I help you with them?" he asked in quick succession, as if he preferred to end all sentences with question marks rather than commit to definite statements. "You can call me Noemi. Miss Tabuada sounds so fussy. That's the sum of my luggage, and yes, I'd love some assistance." He grabbed her 2 suitcases and placed them in the trunk, then went around the car and opened the door for her. The town, as she saw it from her window, was peppered with winding streets, colorful houses with flower pots at their windows, sturdy wooden doors, long stairways, a church, and all the usual details that any guidebook would call quaint. Despite this, it was clear El Triunfo was not in any guidebook. It had the musty air of a place that had withered away. The houses were colorful, yes, but the color was peeling from most of the walls. Some of the doors had been defaced, half of the flower pots in the pots were wilting, and the town showed few signs of activity. It was not that unusual. Many formerly thriving mining sites that had extracted silver and gold during the Colonia interrupted their operations once the War of Independence broke out. Later on, the English and the French were welcome during the Tranquil Porfiriato, their pockets growing fat with mineral riches. But the revolution had ended this second boom. There were many hamlets like El Triunfo, where one could peek at fine chapels built with money when money and people were plentiful, places where the earth would never again spill wealth from its womb. Yet the Doyles lingered in this land when many others had long gone. Perhaps, she thought, they'd learned to love it, though she was not much impressed by it, for it was a steep and abrupt landscape. It didn't look at all like the mountains of her childhood storybooks, where the trees appeared lovely and flowers grew by the road. It didn't resemble the enchanting place Catalina had said she would live in. Like the old car that had picked Noemi up, the town clung to the dregs of splendor.
Thank you, Silvia. Your setting through this book is, one of the main characters, I'd say, the place they go to, High Place. It is the house itself a character, and the dread that slowly seeps out there literally is very tantalizing and, again, propelling. I'm really curious, all 3 of you, about the question of pacing. How do you not give it all away at once? How do you shape your book to build this way? Can I start with you, Rumaan?
Yes, because I really don't know how, and I'm very curious to hear Ashley and Silvia explain it to me. I read other books that I understood had a lot of command over narrative and parceled it out very slowly. And I thought a lot about that strategy. One of the books that was really helpful for me to think about is a book called Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro, in which it's very unclear what's happening, and the revelation of fact is it's very matter of fact, but it always leaves the reader wondering more. And so you have to sort of proceed through the story to get to any concrete answer. But I also read a lot of what we term genre fiction. I read Stephen King. I read a book by the writer Ian Reid called I'm Thinking of Ending Things, which is a wonderful book, just to see how writers who are working in a register we might talk about as horror deal with that. And I learned a lot, especially from Stephen King. I read Pet Sematary, which I'd never read before and is really scary, a very scary book. And what I learned that really surprised me is that that book is quite crazy by page 45. So I sort of thought that he would wait to sort of spool it out, but in fact, it sort of gets quite mad by page 45. And then from there, it just continues to go, it doesn't stop. And so I think I learned something about delivering surprise and then continuing to build upon surprise.
Ashley, what would you like to add to that?
Well, I'm sort of in the same boat as Rumaan, in that I don't really know. But I think that I honestly, I don't think I was really thinking much about what I was giving away when. I think it sort of, and thinking of it now, a lot of the books that I love and the writers that I love often do give quite a bit away at the beginning. And I think this book sort of does too. Like, we know from the opening sort of what has happened, and sort of some of the bigger events in the book we sort of know about right away. But it really is more about sort of how we get there, and sort of the why, less about the what and more sort of about the why. Leila Slimani's The Perfect Nanny, I think, is a great example of that, and that is a book I love, where the first sentence of that book is almost shocking, and how sort of bold it is, and it's really more about the journey to how they get there. I think Celeste Ng does this beautifully as well. We wouldn't consider her to be a thriller writer, but she has huge emotional suspense in her novels, and she really is she's unraveling why the families are in the situations they are, in both of her books, and Little Fires Everywhere and Everything I Never Told You. And I loved those books and loved Leila's writing. And so I think that sort of, I think, gave me sort of permission to really not think so much or not worry so much about that pacing per se and sort of the information, but really just kind of follow the story as I was writing it. I also didn't have a plan with this book at all. And maybe that sort of helps, because I think I was kind of figuring it out as I was going. And I can see myself personally, if I were to plot something out very carefully, I probably would have a harder time with that, of, overthinking it. But yeah, this book really was, and also, truthfully, I worked a lot on that in revisions. Like, I did tons of revisions and many versions of this book, and it was something that I tried to pay attention to sort of once I had the book, and was kind of going back to try to improve it many times. Yeah. So
I find that really fascinating, the whole question of outlines versus no outlines. And as festival staff member Clea Young had said to me today, is it writing to discover? Is it writing to discover? It's a good question. Sylvia, how about you? Did you know, as you were building your suspense, did you know where you were going?
Yeah, I built it. It was 70% mark, quiet, and then ramp up the action a lot at the 70% mark. So that was the original plan. It was kind of like, if it were a movie, if we're thinking about like old-fashioned movies, it would be like watching a 1950s Hammer film, and suddenly at one point in the movie, you're in a Dario Argento film. It's that kind of madness that I wanted to evoke, the sudden shift, and have you ever seen a Dario Argento film with the, flash of color and the insane things that happen in that? You understand what I mean. And same thing if you've seen a Hammer film and you sat and, just watch, somebody slowly, or a Universal film, somebody slowly walk around in a misty landscape back and forth, and you're like, when's something going to happen? And then boom. So yeah, I wanted that shift. I think Gothics can be very slow in their pacing. Certainly traditional, like 19th century Gothics. The monk is really crazy, but there's gets very crazy at one point. But there's a certain sense of slowness that is acceptable in these kinds of stories. If you don't like them, it can feel, I think, frustrating for a modern reader, but I do like that slowness. There's a syrupiness to it that kind of envelops you. I did have a friend who had never read The Turn of the Screw, the famous ghost story, and they got really bored. They told me Sylvia, you said this was a horror story and it's just a piece of crap, you know, and they were like, there's no ghost. And I've read, you know, like so many and so many pages. And I said, well, it's definitely not a slasher kind of story. And that's the difference. I mean, like there's different kinds of horror. Gothic horror tends to feel a little bit different than some of these other, perhaps more subtle versions of horror. And you kind of have to be willing to be enveloped by that. And like I said, not all readers like that. So I just accept that there's some people who are not going to like the pace and, you know, whatever. But if you really like things to be kind of suspenseful or slow, and you're willing to go along for the ride and see where I take you, I think you'll quite enjoy it. But definitely it was like, I knew I would be going at the 70% mark, and I knew that would turn some people off, because there would be some people who would be like, I wanted it all to be slow for like 100% of the book, but I wanted to make that tonal shift and to almost, you know, bump you out of the category. But really not, because like I said, I've read The Monk, and at the end of the book, that guy has committed incest, murder, and is hanging out with the devil. So, you know, it does happen in Gothic novels that sometimes, you know, the shit literally hit the fan.
Well, and okay, like any good thriller though, part of what's going to get the reader through it is when there's more going on than just the surface story. And so I did want to talk to you each, just coming back to this question of what else is underlying these stories of yours and the themes. You know, Sylvia, in your case, you're taking a genre, a Gothic genre, and turning it on its ear a little bit in that you're setting it in Latin America, for instance. You're kind of creepy characters are coming from Europe and inserting themselves in this new climate, in this new place. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you were trying to do with this story in terms of, if not message, just underlying themes?
Well, if you read Gothic novels, you know that there's a certain kind of whiteness about them, and a fear of the other. And the other is, you know, like a person who is not white, Anglo-Protestant, male, wealthy, is portrayed as being the dangerous element or the crazy element. And that's why Dracula is not, you know, from London. He's from the Eastern Europe, which at that point in time is seen as people as being foreign and terrible. You know, nowadays we might say, well, what's the problem? He's from Europe. But at that point in time, he is like something else, an other. And you find that in other kinds of fiction. Radcliffe, for example, and others have these terrifying Catholic Spanish or Italians like Mwahaha, you know, with their mustache, and they are there. And so, and then once you get further on into the 19th century, sometimes the horror is like a colonial horror, where the horror is coming from, you know, India or Africa, and there's something going on there. And so it's always this kind of battle between the forces of good, which are the white Anglo-Protestant men, and the forces of evil. And in this case, it swaps the relationship around, because you've got, you know, this young Mexican mixed indigenous woman who is going into this place that is this former British mining settlement, based on a real British mining settlement in Mexico. Some people don't believe that was true. It did happen. And hanging out with this family, where she's sitting at the table and she's thinking, oh my God, you are all so creepy, and this is such a weird place. And in a traditional Gothic narrative, it would be the complete opposite. You know, you would have the weird kind of creeping brown person coming, like sometimes zombie-like, you know, like, ooh, like that. And they would be like the horrific thing. So this switches it around, and therefore it imposes a different dynamic. So I was trying to play with that. That's one of the answers. I mean, you can do Gothic in many different ways. That was just one, you know, Latin American Gothic you can probably do in 1,000 ways, but that was one way that I was playing with it, was kind of like taking some of these old narratives and inverting them. And also because it ties a lot into eugenics, also inverting that kind of relationship where you have in eugenics this racial pyramid that really kind of goes along with some of these Gothic narratives, so like who's at the top of the pyramid, who's at the bottom of the pyramid. It's very race colored and color coded.
Yeah. Rumaan, your book certainly touches upon this fear of the other. And that comes out loud and clear. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, it's what's happening in the book is there's a confrontation over the possession of a home, the white family who is renting the home and the Black couple who own the home. And it's complicated by the fact of their race. It's also complicated by the fact of their class, that the people who own the home are quite wealthy, and the family who is renting the home, while not poor by any stretch, are sort of like aspirational middle class people. And so I think that the confrontation feels like it feels recognizable from everyone's daily life, even though what the book is talking about isn't necessarily class and race as much as sort of like human existential survival. And maybe it's trying to show that an overemphasis or an overfixation on difference is actually blinding us to a bigger problem that's facing humanity. But you can't also just do away with concerns about class or race or gender altogether. You have the society that we have. So yeah, it was fun to write about. And it's also, I think the book sort of like pretends to be a social satire about race that it isn't entirely. It's sort of, it's a bit of a feint, I think, you know.
Yeah. And it's interesting, your characters at some point, are sort of made to feel, well, this isn't, you're overreacting. This isn't the big deal. There's nothing going on.
Yeah.
This is the big deal. And that certainly, Ashley, leading into yours, that absolutely happens in your story as well. A little bit of, I could say, almost reverse gaslighting, but also just this feeling of not being believed by anybody. Your main character is alone very much. Was that, I mean, and it speaks a bit, I think, to how a lot of women do feel when they first become mothers, which is a whole other topic of the taboo issue around not embracing motherhood or not feeling like a natural born mother. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like I didn't really set out to explore that as much as it sort of came to me much later in sort of writing the book. But yeah, I think it's a lot of it is because, I really set out to write about just about those ideas of expectations in motherhood. Because when I became a mother myself, I realized what a stark difference there was between, what society tells us motherhood is going to be like and feel like, even the way that we're meant to speak about motherhood, versus the reality of it. And I did start writing this book when my first child was 6 months old. And so, I was very much kind of in the throes of that, and experiencing that, when I was kind of, creating Blythe and her story, of her and her daughter and her and her husband. But, yeah. And I think a lot of it for me was really about fear. Like that was sort of more what I wanted to write about is the fear in motherhood that feels, as inextricable as love does almost. I mean, they are two of the biggest, I think, emotions that you have kind of in motherhood or parenthood in general. And so really that was kind of where I started with it. But then kind of sort of exploring kind of, the storyline and this marriage that she has with her husband, it did very much become a situation where, her experience of motherhood and her not being able to have the experience that she had wanted, she can't find connection with her daughter. And she comes to believe there's actually something wrong with her daughter, that she has sociopathic tendencies, essentially. And that truth, that perspective that she has is so inconvenient, for her husband, in the same way that society has sort of taught her what motherhood should be like. Society has taught him, what he should be able to expect out of a partner in life and out of the mother of his child. And so he does sort of, very much kind of shut her down, and try to convince her that, the experience that she is having is not, not accurate, that it really is kind of all in her head. And that really is, the sort of the catalyst that kind of, breaks their marriage down. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was terribly disappointing. I was very disappointed in him.
I know he was yes. He's not the most likable character. No, I agree. Yes. Although I have to say, I've been saying that if you think he's unlikable now, I mean, in the earlier versions of the book before my editors got their hands on it, he was far worse. So this is an improved version of him. Which, well, hard to believe, but
he has nothing on the Doyles, I can tell you. Sylvia's, but we're going to do some audience questions. So first of all, I just wanted to say to our viewers, if you do have questions for our three authors, now's the time to submit them. We've got a few to start us off. And so let me just start with this one. Asking, is your novel rooted in a real life incident, image, or line of dialogue, something that took hold and just wouldn't shake? Who would like to start with that one?
Well, mine is set in a real town that I visited, so.
There you go. And around a real town, a real mine, right? You said.
Yeah. Rather than Monte, people don't believe it, but there is a settlement that was called Little Cornwall in Mexico, in the mountains. And I went there, and there is an English cemetery there, and I thought that Dracula was going to pop out from behind a gravestone. So it was totally real in that sense.
Yeah. And is that where the story started percolating in your head at that time?
I kept that image for many years. I mean, I went there probably like more than 20 years ago to visit. My family is from that region and not from that town, but we stopped there. And it was just this image that I kept in my mind for a really long time, because it was like, a couple of hours before I was in Mexico City. Everything was very modern, and suddenly we were in the middle of nowhere. And it was like, oh, there's a British cemetery to your left, and it was like, what? With all the gravestones aligned to England except for one, that kind of stuff. So yeah, so it got weird fast, and I just kept that image in my mind. But yeah, it's a real place.
Rumaan, Ashley, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I mean, my book is also the house that I described in my book is very much a house that I rented on vacation with my family in 2017. And the geography that I describe in the book is very much a place that we go on holiday. And it was funny to hear Ashley talk about her own book, because it sort of felt so recognizable to me, that notion that like underlying the profound love that you have for your children is this like profound sense of terror. And it sounds so damning to say this, but it's like in our happiest family moments when we are in this beautiful vacation home, I have these moments where I'm like, well, what is the scariest thing that could happen to us here? What's the worst thing that could happen to us here? What could this actually become? And so that was the genesis of this book for me.
Yeah, it's so true.
Yeah, and I think like I was saying, this story sort of came to me, or the idea of Blythe and her experience came to me when I was in my first year of motherhood. I mean, I have a very wandering mind, and exactly what Rumaan was saying, just sort of always thinking of the darker parts of it, the darker parts of that experience of motherhood, and it's like bad things happening, and that constant lingering fear, at almost every moment. Like it's almost like it just occurs to you sort of all day long, this running sort of reel of the bad things that can happen. And also sort of, I think, especially when I was pregnant, kind of about who this child would be. It's sort of it's such an unknown. In the case of kind of, well, all cases, I think, when you're entering parenthood, but, when you are growing this human as kind of, biological child, you sort of wonder like what parts of yourself, you are giving to this child, and what parts of of the child you will be shaping. And you can't possibly know this, we go in so blind in any case. And so that was always, there was fear in that as well, I think, for me. But interestingly, when my son was 2 weeks old, he became very ill, like critically ill. And we spent many weeks on end at the children's hospital, like living there and sort of learning. I mean, at that point, I was just learning how to be a parent, learning how to mother, sort of within the walls of that hospital, with sort of, nurses kind of showing you what to do. And there was so much fear and anxiety in that experience. And it was sort of like this strange thing where, you know, through your pregnancy and kind of even those first 2 weeks with him, that fear loop is sort of running. And then when it actually happened, when something bad actually did happen, you know, at 2 weeks old, it's, you know, obviously it's very jarring and very challenging. But I think it maybe made me want to explore that darkness in motherhood even more, you know, as a way of kind of exploring it in myself. And sort of, it was kind of cathartic to sort of be writing about another dark motherhood kind of experience. So I think that's sort of what kind of set it all off for me at that time.
Oh,
Yeah.
good. Thank you. Rumaan, I've got a question for you from Paul. It's a bit specific and it would depend on you having a copy of the book in front of you. Do you have the book in front of you?
I do. Yeah. Oh, wow. Now I'm scared.
No, don't be. Rumaan, on page 120 and 121, a cascade of images astonished me with their specificity of power, all culminating with a gut punch of children's obliviousness. How did you come to write this section? And for the rest of us, could you just let us know what's happening in that?
Yes. So what he's describing, or what happens on this page, is that the family has these two teenage children who have been bored playing in the pool, and they go wander into the woods. And the perspective in the book shifts from the children to almost someone like God, I think, and describes the trees being communicating with one another, and then describes like the future, or sense of the future, that like the children's Legos will last longer than the pyramids at Giza, which is probably true, which is a really insane thing to think about. And Ashley also mentioned this, like the generous intercession of an editor. My book relies for so long and through so many drafts on the reader not knowing what is happening. And at some point, my editor said to me, "This is very annoying. You have to tell us what is happening." And I'm so glad she said that to me. And the realization was that the book should simply tell the reader what's happening. So the characters never really understand what's happening, but the book begins to explain its concerns directly to the reader. And among those concerns are environmental collapse, political unrest, the potential for humanity to stumble into war by accident. And so what began, I think, as a book that feels like it's a book about a family on vacation becomes hopefully something that's about something bigger than that. So I'm touched that reader liked this part of this book, because this is one of my favorite parts to write, because much again like what Ashley was just saying about like naming your fear, it was very sort of satisfying to simply deploy everything I'm afraid of, like being trapped in a train that's trapped in a tunnel under the river, or dying in an elevator, or all of those things.
Yeah. Oh God, it really, really was.
Yeah.
Tense.
Well, also, Rumaan, I have to mention the teeth, even the teeth in the book.
There is I mean, so, you know, to me, there's something very darling when your children's teeth fall out when they're 6. It's so cute when they're missing their front teeth. Like nothing is sweeter, but there's something really horrific about like the notion of your adult teeth coming out. And so it's just a fun sort of like thing to, again, it's just one of those things that I think a lot of people have bad dreams about losing their teeth. Like, it's a primal fear. Yeah.
This next question is specifically for Silvia. Silvia, mushrooms play a very important role in Mexican Gothic. Can you explain a little bit about this and why you integrated this knowledge into the story?
Oh, I'm a big nerd and I like mushrooms a lot. That's the easy question. I couldn't go mushroom hunting this year because of the pandemic, but normally in like October, I go around here in Vancouver and go find mushrooms. I don't eat them, you know, because I'm not that good at recognizing them, but I take pictures of them and all that. I like fungi in general because it's not an animal or a plant. It's a different kingdom and they have very interesting properties. Fungi can speak to each other. They form these webs underground where they can send information from one side of the forest to the other and tell a tree to send nutrients or don't send nutrients. There's something called a hub tree or a mother tree, which is kind of like the central node of these interconnections. And they're very important for ecological purposes. So we think of a forest as only the things that are above, the trees above, but the things that are all underground are incredibly important. And that's why sometimes you can take a tree from one place, move it to another, and it will not do very well. And it's because of all these fungi filaments that were in the ground are not there, and they're not helping it live the way it should. So they're more important than we think. The other thing is that they have sometimes kind of hallucinogenic activities. So I read several books and papers about how mushrooms might have contributed to the development of religion. So basically somebody ate a mushroom, had, hallucinated that they were talking to God, and then, woke up and basically wrote down, I spoke to God. And it was really a mushroom that made them sick or something like that. So there's a couple of books about that I have read. So that's also incorporated into the novel. And again, this is one of these things where I have had some people that really love it, and I've had some people that tell me, I liked your book until the point where there were mushrooms, and that just sounded stupid. And I'm like, guys, I work at the Faculty of Science of a university. This stuff is actually not as far-fetched as you think it is, and it's not. It's really not. And I think today somebody sent me a picture of this science experiment where they put two kinds of mushrooms and they were connecting them, and so you could hear them talking. They hooked them up to a synthesizer, and so there was some kind of noise produced or something like that where you could hear the mushrooms talking. This is a gross simplification of this process, but basically, they were hearing the mushrooms talk, and they were saying, this is the creepiest thing in the universe. And I said, I told you that this was true. Just nobody really believes me. I'm being gaslighted. I just love fungi. I think they're wonderful and terrifying at the same time, because they do have that thing where if you don't know mushrooms very well, something can look like a delicious champignon, and then you eat it and it can kill you. Yeah. It's not the mushroom's fault. It's an innocent party, but it is true that you have to be very careful sometimes with mushrooms. And like Tipler's bane is a type of mushroom which is perfectly fine to eat, but if you drink alcohol and you eat it, you will die. It's poisonous when it makes that reaction. But if you're not drinking alcohol, it's really good with butter. But again, it's one of these things where you got to know what you're having. So yeah, so they're just like interesting little organisms.
Fantastic. That's good. I think there's another book somewhere.
Yeah.
Ashley, we have a question specifically for you from Rob. Rob says, Ashley, do you consider your opening chapter that you read for us a prologue? And if so, was it a conscious decision not to call it a prologue so that readers would not skip it?
Oh, that's funny. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know why it's not. I do consider it a prologue. I don't know why it's not. I didn't even know it wasn't called a prologue, to be honest. I'm looking at it now. But yeah, you're right. At some point, Rob, it was called a prologue. So I don't know. At some point that was removed. But I did think that scene was important. And so I'm glad that people won't skip it, hopefully, because I think that one thing that scene does that's important is gives us, hopefully gives the reader a sense of empathy for Blythe, which is, I think, hugely important as you get to know her and read through her story. That empathy piece is important to me about her. And so I think that this prologue or this opening chapter sort of sets that tone. So that's kind of why it's there. And also to kind of give, as I was saying before, to kind of really give us that sense of dread and kind of knowing how things are going to end. And it's more about kind of how we get there. So yeah, good question. No one's asked me that. Yeah.
We have time for just a couple more, and good news, we have a couple more. Fabiola would like to know, this is good, during your research or writing process, were there ever moments where you had an, this is too dark moment, or perhaps where you even scared yourselves or creeped yourselves out while writing it? Did you ever have to pull back a bit from where you were going?
Oh, is this for me or for everybody?
All of you.
I'm trying to think. I mean, I had there are some dark moments in the book that people have asked me, like, as a mother, was it hard to write them? And to be honest, it wasn't. And I think I was very much kind of able to separate, the scenes in the book from my own life, and sort of I always write in a coffee shop, but really was just sort of able to kind of close my laptop and go home and kind of just resume my life. I'm sort of able to make that distinction. So, but I think I didn't realize how dark the book was, to be honest, until I sort of had that feedback from other people. And then sort of realized, oh God, it is quite dark. So I don't know what that says about me, but yeah, I did have moments once I started getting that feedback where I thought, oh, is it too dark? And to be honest, when I reached out to agents, I did have some agents come back to me to say that they really liked it, but that it was too dark for them. And so they passed on it. So that did give me a bit of worry at that point, to be honest. Yeah.
Rumaan, Silvia?
I find that, like, I find that I have to sometimes act things out with my body to understand how to write about them. So in my second book, I wrote a lot about breastfeeding, which is obviously something I can't act out, but I did, like, sit down at the table with my shirt off with a stuffed animal at my chest, just to see, like, which hand I would be using to do other things, like if I were breastfeeding a baby. Again, it's just like an imaginative act, but there is a scene in this book where a character's teeth fall out of their mouth, and I tried to do it. So I stood in front of the mirror and I, like, tried to physically inspect my mouth as if one of my teeth was going to fall out, and it made me feel a little unwell, and that part of the book continues to make me feel a little unwell. But I think that that's sort of like, there is this just primal connection to one's teeth, and I think that sort of like that's how it should feel. So yeah, I don't know, I didn't like pull back in any way, but I did sort of embody it, and so I know it made me feel weird. So,
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay, how gross do people want to be grossed out? Okay, so I mentioned in this book that there's something called Massospora cicadina. This is a fungus that infects cicadas. This is a true thing. Some cicadas will emerge and they will be infected by this fungus. It looks like a powdery, like their butt is all powdery, okay? It alters the behavior of the cicada, driving it to mate, even though half of its body is falling apart because it's been invaded by this fungus. So you've got this cicada mating with another cicada, and this cicada is grossly infected with this thing. I knew about this, but because this has been studied since the 19th century, but we know more about it now. So I was looking at some more recent research, and I was looking at some videos of the cicadas with this, and pictures of them with like half of their body covered in spores. And I thought I was okay with it because I've seen lots of things like, horrible parasitical things before, and I'm like, okay, whatever, it's science. And then I went to sleep and I had dreams about cicadas mating, and it was the most horrifying, disgusting thing that you can imagine, because like I said, it's like, imagine if half of your body was like falling off, like a zombie kind of scenario where like limbs are, falling off, but you're having sex. All right. Okay. That is what happens to the cicadas. And now picture it in a dream where there's like giant cicadas doing this. So, there was a scene that was a little bit like that, and I didn't write it in the end because it was really too disturbing to imagine.
That's hilarious. Okay, that wins. Silvia, you win.
Yeah, that's a good answer. That's a really good answer.
We have time for one more question, and I think the three of you have already touched on this a little bit, but just talking about your research and as you went through writing this and working with your editor, how is the book that was ultimately published different from the one that you perhaps originally sold to your agent or your publisher? How is it different from what you originally imagined?
Yeah, I don't even think that's a useful thought exercise, because the truth is the book doesn't exist until the intervention of the editor. Like, only the author's name is on the cover of their book, right? But I think every writer is, I've always been very lucky to work with really brilliant editors whose effect on the finished product I may not even be able to say, you know, like they tell me what other novels I should be reading, what other things I should be thinking about. They'll ask me very open-ended questions, and all of that sort of very materially affects the end of a book. So even if it's not some concrete thing where, oh, the finished book is in third person, but the first draft was in first person, or I changed the setting from Honduras to Mexico, or it's not in 1960, it's actually in 1971. Like, those differences definitely occur between draft one and draft whatever number your final draft is, but none of those are the real book, I don't think. Those are like an historical curiosity, you know, someday, like that's, you know, that's for like scholars to look at when they're looking at Louise Erdrich's papers 50 years from now, but they're not, like, that's not salient with the book that I published, I don't think.
Yeah, that's so true. I totally agree with that. I mean, I think, yeah, and I also, I had 3 editors on this book, because ended up working very closely with, they worked sort of together as a bit of a sort of triangle of a team. And it was the UK and the US publishers or editors. And then because I'm Canadian and was close to the publisher who bought it here at Penguin Canada, because I used to work at Penguin Canada, she did as well, which I was so grateful for. So there was a lot of input, and I mean, they managed it just beautifully in terms of, it didn't feel like I had sort of, you know, 3 different sets of comments, but yeah, incredible influence and sort of how I thought about the book. And to Rumaan's point, like, I mean, there are specific things that changed, but it is such a better book and a very different book, having had them edited it. But I will say now, sort of working on my second book, that is even more so the case. And I feel like they have even more positive, you know, influence on what the book is shaping to be, because I'm, you know, showing them an earlier draft and sort of talking to them about the idea so much earlier in the process than with the push, which, you know, they just saw for the first time, you know, on submission. So I can see that relationship being even, you know, more just crucial to how the book turns out to be, just the more that you work with your editors and the closer you get. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Grateful for it, for sure.
Silvia, do you have anything to add to that one?
No, I mean, like, the draft that my editor got was really close to what was published in the end. The bigger differences were with earlier drafts in my notes and some sections that were not used in the end, but my editor didn't really get to see those. Those had already been, for the most part, chopped off and modified. So we didn't have any conversations about the cicadas, for example. It was just like, here you go. Those were kind of like more internal conversations between me and, yeah, like my brain and I, like having late talks at night, whether we needed this or the other. Yeah, I just tend to kind of like dump things in front of editors and just say, here you go, have fun. And they just go like, what is this? But eventually they like it. So I think I'm doing okay. But a lot of that chopping and rearranging scenes and changing character names, and characters get split or combined, that happens earlier, much earlier on for me. So yeah, but no, it was, yeah, there were some things that if I showed you my notes, you would say, why is that scene not in there? And it's just like, I cut a lot of scenes. I moved a lot of stuff around, but that was in the initial portion of that.
Thank you. And thank you to the 3 of you for joining us tonight. I really enjoyed that. And I just want to remind all of our viewers that these books are available at your favorite bookshop. We encourage you to go out and pick them up. I have to say that I have this habit now of not only reading the books, but also listening to them on audio. And all three of your audiobooks are outstanding as well. So a lot of fun to listen to as well as to read. There's a certain urgency and beauty to all three of these titles, and I can't recommend them enough. Consider this an invitation to all three of you to please come visit us at the Vancouver Writers Fest when we get up and running again in better times, when we can gather and when we can all sit in a venue and share the energy that comes from these types of literary events. I do hope you'll come and visit us down here on Granville Island in Vancouver. And to our audience, thank you so much for joining us tonight at Incite. Please check our website for upcoming events that are happening. And again, thank you so much to Rumaan, to Ashley, and to Silvia. And good night, everybody.
Thank you so much. This was great. Thank you.
Bye-bye.